Hello, students. I thought I'd do a quick update here for week number 3, where we're looking at lesson 4, the Gilded Age. And I thought I'd say a few things about these political cartoons, which I have on this PowerPoint that I use for my seated class. I don't really say as much about them on my lecture video for my online classes, but I thought I'd maybe take a moment here to look at them and noticed how they really portray a concern not just with the increasing wealth inequality in the Gilded Age, but something I want to emphasize is this increasing concern that this wealth inequality and this concentration of wealth is going to corrupt the very political system, that we make decisions by. That it may be endangering a republic, that our representatives are not going to be representing their voters as much as the big businesses that they have to do favors for, and either in order to receive bribes, as this cartoon is implying, as with the Credit Mobilier scandal, where they're receiving stocks at below market value in exchange for voting for certain laws, certain subsidies for businesses. It could be something as blatant as that, or if Congress didn't do what big business wanted, there's always the threat of big business pulling out of the country or pulling out of a state and taking their jobs and their money with them. And just the sheer amount of economic power that they start to wield when they have hundreds of millions of dollars really raises a concern among Americans that the very political system itself could be endangered, that we may be losing our grip on our representative democracy. So I think you see that as a theme in a lot of these cartoons, especially when it comes to someone like an arch villain like Jay Gould, the so-called Mephistopheles of Wall Street. Mephistopheles being a synonym for Satan or Lucifer, where he's using various methods of general unscrupulousness and speculation. Basically gambling on the stock market, often with insider information, to make money and defraud people out of their money, not really contributing anything, arguably, to the actual productive, tangible economy. He was seen as kind of the worst example of this sort of thing, and also often, accruing a lot of political influence around himself, with a lot of money that he could easily spend to for certain favors for politicians. This was an increasing concern, that he would be hijacking or corrupting Congress, the courts, basically everything, along with other people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, owner of Western Union and the telegraph business. And also, by the way, one interesting thing is you see a lot of different explanations for why this is happening. Some critics of the time kind of blame this on the system of private ownership of business itself, as if this were like an inevitable consequence of private ownership, as if it inevitably tended towards concentration and monopolization and huge fortunes accumulating in a few hands. Others, maybe often blamed it on kind of just government not regulating business enough and creating kind of an unfair playing field, either privileging certain businesses over other businesses or privileging business over labor. Because keep in mind, up until this point, there have been this kind of common assumption that wage workers and business owners are kind of legally equal individuals who are voluntarily agreeing to certain transactions. And that's supposed to be kind of the beauty of the free market capitalism is, people have the freedom to invest their money and be entrepreneurs. And, if they need people to work for them, they voluntarily contract with people. It's all about free voluntary contract between individuals with equal legal rights. And for that reason, there's not supposed to be any sort of domination or coercion involved in this arrangement, ideally. But nevertheless, there was an increasing feeling that there was, except it's not coming from the letter of the law. There was no law anywhere telling workers that they had to work for a business for a certain wage, but workers kind of felt like their predicament or their natural desperation for a job was being increasingly weaponized against them to exert leverage on them, and that what was supposed to be this equal contract between wage worker and so-called job creator, we might say nowadays, was not really a contract that was totally free from unbalanced leverage or coercion, even if at the end of the day it was sort of, I guess, technically voluntary, just like perhaps someone with a gun to your head saying they'll shoot you unless you give them all your money. You may voluntarily hand over your wallet, but is that truly voluntary? It gets into the semantics, and increasingly there's kind of a perception spreading that this wasn't a totally voluntary arrangement. This was a problem that needed to be addressed in some way, either in a moderate, reformist, gradual way through maybe regulations or some degree of taxation of business. And then, of course, you have radicals who think that this stems from the very fundamentals of the economic system, and thus the very fundamentals need to be uprooted and completely changed. You had socialists and anarchists with varying ideas of how to do that, which you'll read about in your discussion boards for this week if you haven't already. Bellamy, the socialist, and Lucy Parsons, the anarchist. And you do have some people who think nothing needs to be changed, that certain people win or lose, and some people can't obtain a very good livelihood from the free market. So be it. That the government should not be trying to bail out or help out people who can't hack it in the free market, even if it's widows and orphans, he mentions, or those incapacitated by sickness, that they would just be a burden if the government had to. And it's not the government's proper role to concern itself with that, in his point of view, and Spencer's point of view. In his point of view, the government only is there to protect against overt violence between people. But, how prosperous they are in life, in their career, is up to every individual to sort out. Every man, woman, child for themselves, basically. Perhaps they can, if you feel like charity needs to happen, then you can do it voluntarily through churches and other things. But the government should not compel people to basically give to charity or to help out the poor, or to address economic inequality. That's kind of his point of view. So there are some people who feel like nothing needs to be changed. This is an acceptable state of affairs, the way America was going, where, yes, it did have this great innovation, but also had increasing economic inequality. Herbert Spencer would probably say, well, look, it's not as if workers are maybe getting absolutely worse off. If you look at their real wages after adjusting for inflation, they were maybe creeping upwards slightly, maybe 1 or 2% per year, although there were big setbacks and depressions and banking panics that interrupted that and kind of created this sense that things were not consistently headed in the right direction for ordinary people. But Spencer would probably say trying to get the government to regulate that would be, the cure would be worse than the disease. Something I think that would maybe resonate with students about Spencer is he's definitely more concerned about the government being a tyrant than big owners of wealth or businesses being a tyrant. And that kind of, I think, accords with a lot of intuition from the 1980s onwards ever since, from the Reagan Revolution, which we'll talk about more in Unit 4. But, especially from the Reagan Revolution onwards, there's kind of this idea that government is the greatest potential tyrant to watch out for and to restrain. Whereas, some of these other critics of what was going on during the Gilded Age, they see the owners of great economic wealth as being the greatest potential tyrants and as being able to subvert government. And thus, government is going to be even more of a tyrant if you don't address this economic tyranny. That's kind of their, I guess, point of view. But they're really, they see the economic, what they call tyranny, being at the root of things, the root of the issue. as implied by some of these cartoons. So it's an interesting debate. I look forward to what the class has to say about that. I think some of the class has already written some responses. Jose and Michaela, it's great that you've already responded, but just a reminder to the rest of the class, you have until Saturday before midnight to respond for full credit with your initial post and at least 2 follow-up posts. And of course, there's a quiz as usual to do this weekend, Saturday before midnight. So look forward to that. And I'm curious to see what the class thinks about some of these more radical responses to the Gilded Age inequality. Hopefully the source from the anarchist, Lucy Parsons, will help show that anarchists didn't always fit the kind of stereotype of just a bomb-throwing maniac, although it is fair to say they were more willing to entertain the idea of violence in favor of their preferred revolution. Some anarchists, felt like the American Revolution had gone insufficiently far, and there was that we had a new tyranny taking over the United States, not just from the government but from big business. Anarchists in the late 1800s, tended to object to both concentrations of political power and concentrations of economic power, and some of them even tried to draw parallels between the revolution that they wanted and the American Revolution against the British, and say that we need another round of revolution. So they would basically say, yeah, we're willing to entertain the idea of violence, but we're no more violent than the patriots were, in fighting for their cause, in the 1700s. And we're not any more violent than the founding fathers were, basically. That's how they would, of course, defend themselves. Of course, you don't have to agree with that, or think that their idea of what should replace our society is practical. I have severe questions about that myself, but hopefully you'll get a new perspective on them, which is perhaps underrepresented, and which by no means, had, even really a very large contingent of Americans supporting it, even in the Gilded Age. I'd say at most a few percent of Americans were sympathetic to anarchists. The biggest kind of anarchist-inspired organization ever would probably be the Industrial Workers of the World, this kind of anarchist-inspired labor union that gets set up in the early 1900s. And they peak out at about maybe 100,000 members nationwide. So it's not as if there are tons of Americans at any point, on board with this ideology. But they did have an influence kind of, in a much larger proportion beyond just what their numbers would indicate. And the same thing goes for recently, in fact. If you remember the 2020 George Floyd protests just a few years ago, especially as the protests dragged on and intensified in a few cities like Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, some of the most kind of radical militant protesters came from the self-described movement called Antifa, which is short for anti-fascists, is what they chose to call themselves. And basically the activists who, made up this kind of loose, informal coalition that called themselves Antifa tended to come from either anarchism or socialism or communism. And maybe I'll get a chance at some point to explain maybe the technical difference between socialism and communism. And you'll notice the anarchist author here actually talks about communism being necessary. Yeah. That we're going to have to basically share everything, not have the stronger scramble to get the most, the utter impossibility of awarding to each an exact return for the amount of labor performed will render absolute communism a necessity sooner or later. So, and by communism, she means basically people taking and consuming what they want, the wealth they want from society in some sort of equal manner, sharing things roughly equally, and not trying to account for how much everyone is contributing to society with their efforts or their expertise. And so, and you'll notice she's talking about doing all this without government, without money as a motivating factor. And she's calling this communism, which is, nowadays when you hear the word communist, you think of a kind of an all-powerful government, something more in line with what Bellamy is describing, where the government is the sole employer and basically runs the entire economy. Originally that was kind of often called socialism. Now the revolutionary communists like Vladimir Lenin came up with this idea that eventually they want the sort of communism, stateless, anarchisty communism that Lucy Parsons was aiming for, but that would be long down the road. And as a stepping stone to having basically a society of complete sharing and no government, first you had to go through a transitional stage where you had a very powerful government kind of running everything. So that's kind of that became kind of communist theory, especially after Lenin and the so-called Bolsheviks took over Russia and created the Soviet Union after World War I, which we'll talk about later. So that's how communism came to mean a very strong state. Even though the communists themselves, if you ask them what they were doing, they would always insist that they were still building a socialist society as a transitional stage towards, we pinky promise what we're really aiming for in the very long run is something like Lucy Parsons describes, which is a society without any government whatsoever. That's what they always claim to be shooting for, but they always had excuses for why this couldn't be done right away, why instead they needed a extremely strong, powerful, almost dictatorial state in the meantime to manage things. So basically they had the idea that they needed to use Bellamy's ideas and Marx's ideas of a dictatorship of the proletariat and government as sole employer and runner of the economy as a transitional stage, to the sort of anarchist communism that some anarchists like Parsons would talk about. So hopefully that kind of explains why that term communist, and socialist, why they often get used interchangeably. Because a socialist would, I guess, be someone who wants to go this far with the government, as basically running the entire economy and isn't really looking far ahead to that utopia, beyond that. And maybe they'd like to have that, but they're not, they're just taking one thing at a time. Whereas the communists are saying, yes, we need this in the short term, but we pinky promise we're doing this to achieve stateless communism in the long run. So, society of communes and whatnot is one way to think about it. So, hope you find that kind of interesting, these two radical perspectives that maybe you don't see too much of, that often go underrepresented. But then you also have more of a middle-of-the-road perspective from someone like Andrew Carnegie, who does think that there should be some redistribution of wealth, although notice he still wants to be in control of it. He doesn't want to be forced to do this by the government. Perhaps, if he was, one rational reason for this could have been, I can't read his mind, but logically speaking, if you're afraid of, if the wealth inequality gets so bad that it starts fraying the ties of brotherhood between the rich and poor, and there starts to be more class struggle and class division expressed in American society that starts tearing American society apart, people may start demanding that the government do something about this. So in order to head off that possibility and get out in front of it, it would make good sense to encourage the wealthy themselves to take a step towards some sharing of their great fortunes, such as he did with building public libraries like the library in up by Central High School, Carnegie Midtown Library here in Springfield. So he's kind of a middle-of-the-road, perspective. And often I notice like the one that students tend to find the least objectionable, meaning the one they least object to or disagree with. So I'd be curious to see if this class is similar on that and kind of, I guess, favoring him in general for the most part. But we'll see. I'm curious to see what you all write. And by the way, great job with lesson 3 and reading through some of the dense material in that discussion forum assignment. I think this week's material is maybe slightly longer, but not quite as dense, not quite as difficult to read. So hope you find it interesting. Of course, as usual, let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be curious to see what you all write and for this lesson 4 discussion assignment. And otherwise, I'll see you next week when we'll look at the populist movement, which was kind of another middle of the road, slightly to the left of Carnegie, not quite as radical as the socialists and communists, or socialists, anarchists and communists, but they did want some regulations, reforms, tax and redistribution of wealth. They did want the government to own maybe some industries where they thought the government could operate it more fairly than private owners could, but they don't go quite as far as like Bellamy or Parsons does in wanting society to be completely restructured. So if you're looking for an ideal response to the Gilded Age that is maybe slightly more redistributionist and grassroots than Carnegie, because Carnegie is kind of slightly elitist in wanting to be in charge of this at the end of the day. If you want something that's slightly more redistributionist than him, but not as redistributionist as the socialists or the anarchists, you'll probably be interested in the populist movement next week in lesson 5. But until then, see you later. Good luck this weekend. I'll see what you all have to write.